The heart is a muscular organ just slightly bigger than a person's loosely clenched fist. It's located in the thorax, more specifically between the two lungs, in a space called the mediastinum. The heart is covered by a tough membrane called the pericardium that separates the heart from the other structures in the mediastinum. This position allows the heart to do its job, which is to pump oxygen-rich blood to the entire body and to send poorly oxygenated blood to the lungs, where gas exchange can take place. The heart is made up of 4 chambers, and as a whole can be functionally divided into the right heart, made up of the right atrium and the right ventricle, and a left heart, made up of the left atrium and left ventricle. Both atria have pouch-like protrusions called auricles, which can increase the capacity when needed. Okay, now poorly oxygenated blood from our bodies and other tissues enters the right atrium through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. From there, blood passes into the right ventricle, which pumps into the pulmonary trunk on a voyage towards the lungs and is considered part of the pulmonary circulation. On the other hand, after gas exchange takes place in the lungs, oxygenated blood returns from the lungs through 4 pulmonary veins, which drain into the left atrium. Then, oxygenated blood goes in the left ventricle, and from there it's pumped into the aorta so that it reaches the whole body and is considered part of the systemic circulation. So looking at it in 3 dimensions, the heart looks like an upside-down, tipped-over pyramid with 4 sides, a base that's mostly posterior, and an apex or tip that points anteriorly and slightly to the left. On an anterior or posterior view in 2 dimensions, the heart is shaped like a trapezoid, so it has a superior and inferior as well as a right and left border. It's important to understand what comprises the borders of the heart, because the heart is rotated to the left on its longitudinal axis within the mediastinum, so the apex is directed more posterolaterally. The superior border is formed by the right and left atria. Along the superior border, from right to left, there's the superior vena cava, which enters the right atrium. Then there's the ascending aorta, which emerges from the left ventricle and then curves posteriorly to form an arch, called the aortic arch. Finally, there's the pulmonary trunk and its 2 branches, the right and left pulmonary artery, with the right pulmonary artery going under the aortic arch. The inferior border is almost horizontal, and is made up mainly by the right ventricle and part of the left ventricle. The right border is made up by the right atrium, and it's between the superior and inferior vena cava. And finally, the left border is mainly made up by the left ventricle and part of the left auricle. Now pay a bit of attention here, because the end of the inferior border, along with the lower part of the left border, make up the apex of the heart, which represents the tip of the left ventricle. Some of these features can also be identified on a posterior-anterior chest X-ray. The heart silhouette is between the lungs, and the right border made up by the right atrium, as well as the left border made up by the left ventricle and part of the left auricle, can be clearly seen. Above the left auricle, we can identify the pulmonary artery and the aortic arch. The superior and inferior borders of the heart aren't as easy to see as the right and left borders. Now, let's identify the structures in an anterior and posterior view. On an anterior view, we can identify several structures, starting with the 4 chambers and ending with the great vessels. From right to left, there's most of the right atrium located superiorly and inferiorly to it, the right ventricle. They're separated by the coronary sulcus, also called the atrioventricular groove, or AV groove for short. Then, there's the auricle of the left atrium and the left ventricle, which are also separated by the coronary sulcus. The right ventricle and left ventricle are separated by the anterior interventricular sulcus. Moving on, you can actually see parts of the great vessels on an anterior view. So from right to left, there's part of the superior vena cava, which opens in the superior part of the right atrium. Then there's part of the inferior vena cava, which also opens in the right atrium, but the opening can only be seen on a posterior view. Then there's the ascending aorta, which emerges from the left ventricle and then arches toward the back to form the aortic arch. The branches of the aortic arch can also be seen, and from right to left, they are the brachiocephalic trunk, which branches into the right subclavian artery and right common carotid artery, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian artery. Finally, medial to the left auricle, there's the pulmonary trunk, which emerges from the right ventricle and branches into the left and right pulmonary arteries, with the right pulmonary artery going under the aortic arch. Interestingly enough, the superior portion of the proximal left pulmonary artery is connected to the inferior surface of the aortic arch by the ligamentum arteriosum. Even though this fancy-termed element is just a fibrous band now, back during embryological development, it used to connect the aortic arch and the pulmonary trunk as an adaptation of fetal circulation to intrauterine life. Now, on a posterior view, we can see the left atrium and the left auricle, most of the left ventricle, as well as the right atrium and right ventricle. As before, the atria and ventricles are separated by the coronary sulcus, but now the right and left ventricle are separated by the posterior intraventricular sulcus. In the upper portion, above the coronary sulcus, there are the great vessels. The left and right pulmonary veins, which bring oxygenated blood into the left atrium, and the left and right pulmonary arteries, which emerge from the pulmonary trunk and bring deoxygenated blood to the lungs above them, the aortic arch, and the superior and inferior vena cava. It's also important to visualize that the most anterior portion of the heart is the right ventricle, and the most posterior part of the heart is the left atrium, which lies directly anterior to the esophagus. And time for a pop quiz. What are the borders of the heart and what structures form them? Very well, let's get back at it. Now let's have a look at each chamber of the heart, starting with the right atrium. This is a right anterolateral view of the heart, where we dissected the right atrium in order to see its contents. The right atrium has a smooth, thin-walled posterior part called the sinus venerum, where both superior and inferior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus, open. Then there's a rough, muscular anterior part formed by the pectinate muscles. Externally, the smooth and rough parts of the atrium are separated by a vertical, shallow groove called the sulcus terminalis. Internally, these structures are separated by a vertical ridge called the crista terminalis. Inferiorly, you can also see the right AV orifice, also known as the tricuspid orifice, which is where the blood from the atrium goes into the ventricle. Now, the superior vena cava enters through the superior part of the right atrium, which is roughly at the level of the third costal cartilage. The inferior vena cava opens inferiorly almost parallel to the superior vena cava, roughly at the level of the fifth costal cartilage. Finally, the coronary sinus opens between the tricuspid orifice and the inferior vena cava orifice. Now the right and left atrium are separated by the intraatrial septum, which has a depression called the oval fossa, or fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of the oval foramen, or foramen ovale, that connected the atria during embryological development. In fetal life, oxygen-rich and nutrient-rich blood travels directly into the left atrium from the right atrium via the foramen ovale to bypass the pulmonary circulation. Let's stay on the right track and move into the right ventricle. Just like before, we're going to look at an anterior view of the heart where we dissected the right ventricle. The right ventricle has an inflow part, where blood gets inside the ventricle, and the outflow part through which blood leaves the right ventricle. The inflow part has muscular elevations called the trabecula carne, and the outflow part is formed by an infundibulum called the conus arteriosus, located superiorly and leads to the pulmonary trunk. So far, so good. Now, the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the tricuspid orifice, which is posterior to the body of the sternum at the level of the fourth and fifth intercostal space. The tricuspid orifice is surrounded by a fibrous ring that's part of a fibrous skeleton of the heart, keeping its shape constant. And in order for blood to flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle at exactly the right time during each heartbeat, there's a tricuspid valve attached to the tricuspid orifice. It's called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 cusps or leaflets that open and close during systole and diastole. An anterior one, a posterior one, and a septal one. The base of each cusp is attached to a fibrous ring, while the free edges of the cusps are attached to tendinous cords called the chordae tendineae. These chordae tendineae anchor the leaflets to the papillary muscles, which are projections of the right ventricle. The anterior papillary muscle is the largest one and arises from the anterior wall of the right ventricle. Its